Hi, everyone, and hi, Stephen. How are you?
Very well, Sophie. Nice to see you again.
Yes, you too. So, Stephen Long is with me. Stephen has a long history of being an investigative, that's the hardest word ever, journalist, and is now working with the Australia Institute, particularly looking at our native forests and what's going on with the logging in our native forests. Steve's been really looking at the Great Koala National Park, what's happening up there, because recently the state government announced that there would be the Great Koala National Park. And we know now that our beautiful koala species are on the endangered list. And if the trajectory keeps going the way it currently is, then they will be extinct in the wild by 2050, our beautiful koalas. So, Stephen, tell us about why was the Great Koala National Park created and what's going on at the moment? Has it actually stopped the logging in that area?
It's been Labor policy for nearly a decade to create the Great Koala National Park, and there's been a sense of urgency around this, Sophie, because koalas are critically endangered, and the predictions are that on the current trajectory, they will cease to exist in New South Wales in the wild. Now, the Great Koala National Park has been a long held dream. It's an area that, if it was gazetted within the boundaries that have been discussed, would add 176,000 hectares of public forest estate, state forest, to existing national park to create a vast forest sanctuary in an area where 1 in 5 of the koalas still living in the wild exist. So there are these biodiversity hotspots in the area, critical koala habitat, important
Mm.
to safeguard. And you were asking me what's happening. Well,
What's happening?
sadly,
Is it being safeguarded? I mean, I think we were all breathed a huge sigh of relief when it was announced that this Great Koala National Park was actually had been established. But what has gone on since then? Has the logging actually stopped in that area?
in short, no. The New South Wales government chose not to put a moratorium on logging whilst the final boundaries of the park were firmed up and the park was gazetted. And so we have a situation where native forest within the proposed boundaries of the Great Koala National Park is being felled at a pretty rapid rate. I've been up there twice now and spent quite a bit of time on the ground, and we've been filming, and we saw at Shears Knob, within the area of the proposed park, native forest being taken down just in the last couple of weeks. I've spoken to people on the ground. There was a beautiful glade of native forest that ran by a creek, and that area, last I heard, the huge logging machines are about 100 metres away. We're told the estimate is that hundreds of hectares are being felled every week, and and cumulatively you're seeing significant loss of native forest. There is also plantation forest within the boundaries, and it will be important to retain some of that to create wildlife corridors. But you've got both plantation and old growth native forest being mown down.
Yeah. So that just you're mentioning there plantation and old growth native forest. So there is a real difference, isn't there? So we already in New South Wales, you can correct me with the statistics, but in New South Wales, already 80-90% of the timber industry is plantation based. Is that right? And only 10%, that residual 10% is this beautiful old growth native forests. And but yet so we get most of our timber, I believe, from the plantation, yet still we're knocking down our beautiful old growth forests as well.
And the tragedy there is that native forest logging in New South Wales is a loss making enterprise. So taxpayers subsidise the State Forestry Corporation to do native forest logging. And yes, there is extensive plantation, a lot of softwood plantation, pine radiata that's used for building houses and making furniture. But there's also hardwood plantation of eucalypts, typically black butt. And yet we're choosing to go in and log native forest where you've got a lot of biodiversity, a lot of different species of trees, and critical habitat for a whole lot of species, including endangered species, not just the koala, but greater gliders. And this is an area very rare because greater gliders and koalas coexist within this zone. And one of the things that's happened recently is ecologists, environmentalists, citizen scientists have gone out and been doing their own counts and discovered that there are far more greater gliders than the timber industry had acknowledged. And then they discovered that timber workers had actually been looking for them during daylight rather than at dusk, just turning to dark, which is when you find them. And so you've got habitats that are important for a number of endangered species that are being cut down, and the EPA not yet responding to complaints that there's been a mass underestimation of how many species there are in these forests.
Yeah, I'd like to have a chat to you maybe a little bit later about the strength or the robustness of the EPA, but just coming back to these extinctions, Australia leads the world when it comes to mammal extinctions. We are responsible for 35% of all mammal extinctions, and we seem to be continuing on that vein, unfortunately. And when we talk about koalas, we know that a lot of people relate to the koala and the greater glider, but obviously these habitats are home to so many hundreds of different species. They're teeming with life, and they're just being, knocked down. So, what is the value of these old growth native forests? Like you would hope that they're being sold for a lot of money.
Well, sadly, no. And I think that that's what a lot of people believe. We had responses when we produced a video looking at this. We had people respond saying, "Oh, yeah, but I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this who've got beautiful timber floorboards in their homes or live in a beautiful timber home." But most of the wood that's used for those higher grade uses of making furniture or making houses is actually softwood. And this native forest is being used to make tomato stakes, pallets, or simply wood chips, pulp, and sawdust. And that is really tragic. You could understand the idea if there were beautiful trees being used, beautiful native trees being used for higher value uses, which would store carbon. Well, there's a place for that. But you can actually achieve that out of hardwood plantations as well. But to have native forest, critical habitat, being turned into wood chips, pulp, and pallets or sticks to hold up tomato plants just seems tragic to me.
Well, it is tragic. So tell me about the profitability of the native forest logging arm of New South Wales Forestry Corps, because as we said, there's the distinction between the two arms of it, the plantation side and then the native forest logging side.
Yeah.
What's the profitability like of the native forest logging side?
So plantation is profitable. They make good money out of plantation timber harvesting, but they've lost millions of dollars over recent years by logging native forest. And so we're all backing that. Taxpayers in New South Wales are actually paying to subsidise the timber workers to tear out native forest. And it makes no sense.
So we're basically as taxpayers subsidizing the pushing the extinction of our koalas and our native animals in that
Yep,
regard.
yep. And
Yeah.
you and we all understand it is important to create jobs and have jobs, and there's a lot of people who have an affinity with this work. However, I don't think you can say just because someone's saying, well, there's been 3 generations of my family have been timber workers and we want to take out the big sticks in the native forest, not just be in plantations. I'm not sure that I can support that idea. Yes, let's maintain an industry, but to actually have what remains of native forest and old growth forest being hacked down is a different story altogether.
So let's have a chat about the research that the Blueprint Institute did. They did a cost benefit analysis looking at that area where the Great Koala National Park is up in the northern New South Wales. And from what I understand, it showed that if they were to end native forest logging, so that's not the whole entire, that's not including plantation, but just the native forest logging part. If they ended it this year instead of at 2040, they would save something like $40 million, was it? I know there's different numbers, but I think would save around $45 million. And there's so many other ways that, you know, we can earn, well, that these trees, these forests can be valued, isn't there? There's so many other uses for it, apart from their natural beauty and being home to our wildlife.
Well, it's a while since I've read that blueprint study, but it is the case that it makes no economic sense to continue the native forest logging. The other thing is that a lot of the values here, Sophie, are very, very important in a multitude of ways. Clean water. We're looking at increasing the population on the mid-north coast, and the forests play a critical role in filtering water. And without them, we've got real problems in terms of population growth in that region and having drinking water. Broad environmental values in terms of biodiversity. This is some of the most biodiverse forest remaining in the world. And yeah, so there are multiple ways that these forests contribute. And I think what we have to recognize is that really in the context of what's happening around the world with loss of biodiversity, what's happening around the world with loss of biodiversity and with climate change, these forests are priceless.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. So if you look at a forest, how much they're the most efficient carbon sinks that we have. And if you actually cut them down, you're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So you're adding to climate change. Whereas if you keep them there, they're sinks for carbon. So we're acting against climate change. So it makes sense to keep them just in the context that we're in, where we're facing worsening climate change or global warming, we're facing an extinction crisis and an environmental crisis. But it is really important to consider weighing up the pros and cons of what would happen if we were to end native forest logging in Australia, in New South Wales, because we don't want timber communities to suffer or to be harmed in any way. And so they're just looking forward at the job creation that could come from protecting and preserving these forests. What type of jobs would there be for people in tourism and saying engineered new wood products as well?
Well, one issue, Sophie, that I think is fascinating is we're going to need people to manage these forests, and we could convert a lot of the people who actually know quite a bit about the timber in those forests into people who are looking at preserving and restoring the habitat. So there would be jobs for former timber workers in actually working to create a haven for the trees that they know so well. But beyond that, uh, the ecotourism that could come from this is massive. I've had so many inquiries since we did the research from around the world, from journalists around the world about this. There's huge opportunities to actually contribute a lot to these economies, and we're also talking about quite a small number of jobs, and many of those jobs could simply transfer from logging native forest into plantation timber harvesting.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, Australia being a long way from the rest of the world, we could be a mecca. We could be an ecotourism mecca, couldn't we? Because we do have these extraordinary forests, you know, where in a lot of other parts of the world, they don't have the nature that we have. So I can imagine a future economy based on beautiful assets, beautiful natural assets like this. So it is something to keep in mind. So where are we at? So I think my last question is, when do you think, what do we need to do? When do you think the logging will stop in the Greater Koala National Park? And what do we need to do from here?
The government is consulting with industry, environmentalists, and Indigenous groups at the moment and has delayed gazetting the park. I've been told informally that they believe that they will have it gazetted by the end of the year, but that's a long way away. And the pace that logging is happening at, one of the things that worries me is they haven't committed finally, the state government, to what the precise boundaries of the park will be. And if we allow logging of native forests to continue, it could compromise the environmental and ecological values of that forest to an extent that some of it's left out, and we actually get a compromised park. And so we really need to shut this down as soon as possible. We need to stop the logging. The government should really declare a moratorium now until the final boundaries of the park are resolved, rather than let the logging go on and undermine the integrity of this environment.
So on that note, I just wanted to let everyone know that I've got a native or ending native logging forest pledge. So I might say that again. I've got a ending native forest logging pledge and native forest pledge. So we have people from both sides, all political parties have signed this. We've got former environment ministers, former premiers of different states, that have signed on this. We've got scientists, we've got all sorts of environmental bodies on this, and experts in the area who are all calling for there to be this moratorium on native forest logging, but also to end native forest logging altogether, because in the end it's a win-win. It'll actually save us money, and we'll have these beautiful parks to hand down to our future generations as well. So Stephen, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Any final words for us?
One final observation: New South Wales is now an outlier, Sophie, because Victoria and WA have both moved to end native forest logging, and it's time we got with the program.
Yeah, we need to get with the program. Come on, New South Wales, we can do it. Thanks so much, Stephen. Great to chat to you.
You too, Sophie.
Okay, see you later.
See you.